Hello, this week marks World Press Freedom Day, and we're going to discuss this subject alongside another title that we've appointed to this meeting, which is the degradation of Western media. This week, ironically enough, there's a U.S. poll in NPR, National Public Radio, that said there was a record number of American people had popular distrust of the established media outlets, and yet we're supposed to be celebrating World Press Freedom Day today. With me today, I've got the pleasure of Bruce Gagnon and Daniel Lazar. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Be with you.
Bruce Gagnon is the co-founder of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He's written for many international news outlets, including Counterpunch, Asia Times, and Le Monde Diplomatique. Daniel Lazar is a specialist in U.S. constitutional law and history. He's the author of The Velvet Coup, The Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the Decline of American Democracy. Daniel has also written for numerous outlets, including The Nation and Consortium News. So again, welcome, gentlemen. Now, before I give it over to you guys, I'm just going to run through a pretty much a random list of what I consider to be, and I'm sure other people might also see them as major topics, major events over the last few months and currently. And yet the Western media have given negligible, if not zero, coverage to these major events. I'm going to start with the Nord Stream sabotage. The Nord Stream pipelines under the Baltic Sea blown up in September. Seymour Hersh, a legendary, respected journalist, reported that the U.S. government at the senior level, i.e. President Biden, ordered that sabotage, potentially an act of international terrorism. Yet the Western media have given zero coverage to Seymour Hersh's fantastic reporting. Zero coverage. I mean, that's quite amazing. Another topic, just randomly now, NATO weapons have been used to kill Russian civilians in parts of Russia, in the Donbass region, which is now part of Russia. Last week, the city of Donetsk was hit, a residential area hit with US-supplied HIMARS rockets. Several civilians were killed, including children. And as far as I know, there was zero Western media coverage of this very serious potential war crime. Again, this Ukrainian government or regime, the Kiev regime that NATO backs and the US has funded to the tune of $100 billion. This regime there's copious videos showing this regime forces abducting people on the street, civilians, forcing them into the armed forces, abducting them and manhandling them. This regime is burning down Orthodox churches that they accuse of being affiliated to Russia. This regime every week renames a street in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities in honor of notorious fascist collaborators of Nazi Germany during World War II, Ukrainian fascist figures who collaborated with Nazi Germany. I'm going to continue with this random list, guys. Julian Assange, he's in 4 years now in solitary confinement in a top security British prison. The UN has reported that it's a form of torture. He's awaiting extradition to the United States, where he could spend the rest of his life in jail on trumped up charges, many would argue, of spying and hacking. Many other people who support Julian would say his only crime is that he told the truth through WikiLeaks about US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm going to stop there to give it over to my esteemed guests, but that's just a selection of what I consider to be very big stories, major events, and yet our Western media has given zero coverage of it, which tends to negate any sort of claim of being an independent, truth-telling or fact-based media. I will let Bruce Gagnon, first of all, take a shot at all that, followed by Daniel. Bruce, would you like to say something for us?
Thank you, Finian. I'd like to start with two stories, if I could. The late 1800s in the United States, soon after the Civil War, the Civil War, where the growing military-industrial complex made a lot of money, and then the Indian Wars that were going on simultaneously and after the Civil War. And so cut to South Dakota in the 1870s, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, two of the great native leaders of the Lakota people, were still on the run, refusing to go on the reservations, but their people were starving. And so even then, they went ahead and went onto the reservation. At this point, the Indian Wars were pretty much over, and the military-industrial complex, no longer having the Civil War or the Indian Wars, were desperate. And so the Eastern newspapers across the country came up with a story with artist renderings of Crazy Horse back on the warpath, raping white women and children, killing people, burning their homes down. And so the Congress of the United States, under pressure by the American people who read these stories, made new appropriations for the Indian Wars, while Crazy Horse was sitting on a teepee on a reservation with no gun or horse to his name. So this game of lying by the corporate media has been going on for a long time. Another story that I think is also important is something we learned in the Pentagon Papers. At the time of the coming to rise of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, it was clear that in the United Nations elections, he was going to win overwhelmingly. The CIA was not happy about it. So they fabricated a letter under his name saying that once elected, he would round up all the Catholics in the North and kill them. Quickly, the United States brought in the American media. They filmed a mass exodus organized by the CIA of Catholics from the North to the South. The next day, it was on the TV back home. And the day following, the Congress appropriated money for the first advisors to go in officially and that began the U.S. war effort in Vietnam. So both these cases, I think, really illustrate quite well how the American media has long been used to further the interests of the war machine in our country. And obviously, it goes on today. The corporate media is a tool of the military-industrial complex. And so today we face censorship, disinformation from this corporate media, corporate punditry, not real journalism, and overall, across the land, a growing conformity of thinking amongst many, many Americans. Your earlier statement in your entry there and your intro that polls were showing that people were not so supportive or trusting of the American media. That's a good sign. But still, sadly, we see in the peace movement right now in the United States over the Ukraine-Russia war, we see real division because so many people have swallowed the pill of this corporate media, believing the lies that are put out daily by these institutions that are supporting the U.S. war machine. I think your statement about Nord Stream is right on. It's hard to believe that the only story that's been really reported by mainstream media was this Gilligan's Island story that a few Ukrainian people got on a little yacht and went and did this massive undertaking of going to great depths to blow up these pipelines. Just unbelievable story to anyone that is thinking whatsoever. But something that is never mentioned about Nord Stream by the mainstream media or even mainline environmental groups is the massive methane release that came from that explosion. The United Nations says it's the greatest methane release in the history of the planet. Now, why aren't people talking about that? Everybody that's so worried about climate change, my God, here's a perfect example of how the military is undermining our ability to deal with climate change. And finally, about Julian Assange. I just saw the other day that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said that if he was elected president, he would be pardoning Julian Assange. Well, isn't that stepping out there? It is interesting that very few people, if any, in Congress or in the White House or anywhere else in official Washington is ever touching that idea of pardoning Julian Assange. So I'm glad to be on this interview with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Bruce, thanks very much for that great overview and the historical background. I just make one comment on what you said there, Bruce, and that is, like Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers. You know, if I remember correctly, like the New York Times and Washington Post published his reporting on, say, the My Lai massacre and other huge crimes in a way that was very detrimental to the U.S. government reputation. Yet, like 50 years on, these publications don't even touch Seymour Hersh now. So, I mean, while I really appreciate your long historical view on the lying media, which is really right on, but I think there's also maybe a very rapid decline in the last few decades where now media don't even touch people like Seymour Hersh, whenever a few decades ago they did. So there's something very disturbing about that blanket censorship of a really respected journalist who only a few decades ago was respected and would have been published. So I'll just make that comment, Bruce. But thanks, Bruce, for that great overview. Daniel, please give us your thoughts.
Well, I agree with everything that Bruce said, of course. The situation is paradoxical. You're correct. The mainstream media has never been more outrageous or more blatant in its use of propaganda in support of the American regime. And Nord Stream is the perfect example. Nord Stream is an astonishing act. It was a $20 billion facility, so a major facility that, by all appearances, all evidence suggests, was blown up by the U.S. on September 26th. And the press immediately threw itself into the effort to excuse this act or to cover up the U.S. role. I mean, first it floated theories that it was Russia's handiwork, even though that was clearly made no sense. Why would Russia blow up its own facility when, if they wanted to stop the flow of gas, all they had to do was throw a switch? But nonetheless, the New York Times, the mainstream media published, statements by top intelligence officials that it looked like it was Russia's handiwork. Joe Biden himself made a statement, didn't quite actually accuse Russia, but said that Russia was lying in its denials of responsibility. So it was a roundabout way of blaming Russia, and no one challenged Biden. Nobody decided to question his account. And then after several months went by, and after the Chancellor of Germany made an emergency visit to the White House to confer with Biden, German and American press outlets, the New York Times, for one, published a story which was really quite obviously bogus, that somehow 6 unaffiliated saboteurs had rented a 50-foot yacht in a German Baltic port, somehow used that yacht to transport a ton of explosives, and had then planted the explosives around the pipeline, had gotten out of there, and had blown it up instead. And the story made no sense, and all kinds of experts who were consulted, quickly pointed out the obvious technical problems with that narrative. But nonetheless, it was an example of the press, of the U.S. press, sort of hastening to deflect attention from the American role. Mm-hmm. And then just a few weeks ago, the New York Times and Washington Post, within days of one another, published very similar stories. The Washington Post quoted an anonymous European diplomat saying that at international diplomatic gatherings, the question of Nord Stream was the scandal that no one wanted to discuss. Everyone wanted to keep silent, and the Post article, published that statement without comment, thereby, implicitly giving its imprimatur to that statement. And a few days later, I think it was just 3 days later, the New York Times did the same thing. It quoted a Danish naval official saying that no one knows who did it, and that's probably best that no one knows. And the Times published that comment again without comment, and thereby implicitly endorsing that point of view. So, as you pointed out, it's amazing because the New York Times, the Washington Post, during Watergate, had been at the forefront of the investigation, had been highly aggressive, covering themselves with plaudits for their role in uncovering official abuses. But nonetheless, even despite their self-congratulatory tone, they were very aggressive, and they embarrassed the government and got out information the government didn't want to see published. And the same thing was true with the Pentagon Papers and other scandals that those papers took a leading role in uncovering. But now we have the opposite, where those papers are now collaborating in a cover-up, where somehow journalists think that their role is to cover up in behalf of the government. And I will point out that why they're doing this is that Nord Stream is really, really important. I mean, essentially, the facility is co-owned by Germany and other European countries. And if it's true the U.S. did it, and so far an abundance of evidence points to the U.S. and no countervailing evidence points to anybody else. So if we assume the U.S. did it, then essentially the U.S. engaged in an act of war against a chief ally, Germany. Mm-hmm. And so this explosion has the capability of exploding even more thoroughly the entire NATO alliance. Mm-hmm. Because what is the purpose of a military alliance if it allows one member of that alliance to launch a devastating attack, military attack on another member of the alliance? Mm-hmm. I mean, presumably it leaves Germany no choice but to question its role, its ongoing role in NATO. Now, so it's been what, 7 months so far since that bomb went off, and everybody is and it's a guillotine waiting to fall, and everybody's trying to ignore it because everyone knows when the truth comes out, when, say, the Danish or Swedish or German intelligence are forced to publicly acknowledge that the U.S. was the responsible party, everyone knows that when that happens, governments will topple and alliances will fall apart. I mean, the current traffic light coalition in Germany, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats. The Social Democrats will be profoundly, deeply embarrassed, wounded, compromised. How will they be able to go forward? Yeah. I mean, this is an immense crisis which is just waiting to explode. But the press, rather than frankly and bravely exploring what's at stake, I mean, essentially they are playing the role of the three monkeys. hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil, and encouraging their readers to adopt the same attitude.
Mm.
Now, just one quick thing that I don't want to take up my time, but I said before it was paradoxical because the media is very, very influential, very powerful. Publications, it's hard to convey to you in Ireland the role played by the New York Times here in the U.S. But the New York Times sets the pace for the American corporate media in general. I mean, when MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post, they start their news day, they have their morning editorial meeting, everyone's got a copy of the New York Times in front of them.
Mm.
And the New York Times line is basically the line they take. Someone once described Americans as a herd of independent minds. So for all the freedom that Americans brag about, they use that freedom to end up saying the same thing. And that line is dictated to a very great degree by the New York Times. So the mainstream media has a very pernicious role. It's covering stuff up. It's not getting the truth out. But the paradox is that we have this thing called the internet. And the internet has a zillion different voices weighing in. Some of them flaky, some of them conspiratorialist, some of them pretty good. Mm-hmm. So the truth is getting out there, and I think you see that internationally, people, and also be aware. I think the figure is 5 billion people. 5 out of the 8 billion people on Earth now have regular access to the internet, which is pretty amazing. Mm. And so the truth is getting out. People are not stupid, and they can smell a lie. They know when they're being lied to. They know when they're being manipulated. And so I think the longer this Nord Stream cover-up goes on, the more apparent it is to those 5 billion internet users that someone is not telling the truth. Mm. And that someone is the United States. Mm. So all the mainstream media in the world can huff and puff, but they can't. In the end, their control on global opinion is less than complete, and I think that is just fantastic. So I want to leave this on a conclude on an upbeat note.
Yeah, well, thanks, Daniel, for steering it in a positive and I think a realistically positive direction towards the end as we sum up with Bruce and yourself. I just want to point out, like it just came to me as you were talking, like the fable of the emperor with no clothes. The little boy who pointed out that the emperor was actually naked, and the transformative effect of a small voice in a large context. I mean, and I think it's the analogy here is with our mainstream media, the lying media, not just in America but in Europe too. I mean, Bruce, Daniel, where is led by the nose here too? By the media, and the New York Times is often quoted by European media as the formative news leader. But anyway, we're in a kind of a situation where the legacy media or the establishment media have become so divorced from reality that they're in a very precarious pedestal, that one little kind of pebble from that pedestal could see a very huge crash, as you're kind of alluding to. Bruce, I wonder, would you share that kind of realistic optimism about alternative media?
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's what we're doing right now, and a lot of people are doing it every day, and many of them are getting huge numbers of viewers. So the public is turning away from the corporate media to the alternative media, but we have to always have critical eyes. For example, Democracy Now!, which I used to be a big fan of many years ago, but has really turned into essentially, as far as I'm concerned, a mouthpiece for the corporate agenda, because they increasingly are filtering news in such a way that they're leaving out a lot of things and bringing in things that aren't really so great. And there are a few other medias like that as well. So we have to be careful. We have to look at who's funding particular alternative media to make sure that we don't get misled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Daniel, a closing comment from yourself on the future of the media battle, or the battle for truth, battle for facts and historical truth?
Sure. I just want to mention Julian Assange. And I also want to mention Evan Hershkovitz, or Gershkovitz, however you pronounce his name, this Wall Street Journal reporter who has been arrested and charged with treason or espionage, I'm sorry, in Russia. And I think it's very important to point out that is the absolutely inappropriate nature of that arrest. I mean, it's conceivable that he may have done something wrong. It's conceivable that he may have violated a regulation. That's perfectly possible. But obviously, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. But obviously, this is a gross overreaction, and it is a very troubling assault on the press that does not bode well for Russia, and certainly does not bode well for Hershkovitz. And I don't want to see this guy, languishing in jail merely for doing his job. If he did something wrong, charge him appropriately, give him an appropriate sentence. I'm sure, he can't have done anything tremendously serious, and then let him get on with his work or send him on his way. But let me just point out that all these people who are going on about this Wall Street Journal reporter are staying silent about Julian Assange,
which arguably is a hugely more, in case of injustice, Julian Assange's case, it's pretty out in its own, and really very disturbing that there is such a lack of media campaigning for his rights and his release. I mean, I know there was a joint editorial a few months ago by the New York Times and the Guardian and a couple of other European media, but generally there's been just an absolute, ignoring of his plight, which is very disturbing, considering the great contribution he did do in terms of telling the truth about war crimes. Bruce, one last shot at the subject, and Daniel too, to sum up. Sorry, by the way, Daniel, sorry, I didn't mean to cut in on you.
No, it's fine.
You were going to say something, I think. Sorry, I cut in on you.
Oh, I was going to say that his treatment reminds me that of Soviet dissidents in the 70s who were sent to insane asylums and were shot up with Thorazine, and they suffered terribly ill effects. He's been in solitary for 4 years. Apparently, he's showing similar damage to his health and his mental well-being. Joe Biden called him a high-tech terrorist, the same man who goes on and on about this Wall Street Journal reporter, but actually condemned Assange as a high-tech terrorist. The U.S. is trying to extradite him, and if they succeed, he could very easily be put away in a maximum security prison for the rest of his life. This is astonishing.
I think this week, Daniel and Bruce, Biden was quoted as saying that journalism is not a crime, referring to the Wall Street Journal journalist Evan Gershkovitz. Yet, amazingly, there's no mention of Julian Assange. So it seems quite a travesty, for Biden to articulate some kind of moral concern for one person, and yet Julian Assange is left to rot in a dungeon with mental torture. Yeah. Bruce, sorry, over to you, Bruce, for a final shot.
Well, it's a crime to expose the neocon foreign policy, their agenda. It's a crime. And it's not a crime if you collaborate with it, if you're complicit with that agenda. And that's the situation we have in, yes, not only the United States, but throughout the West, in the corporate, the legacy media. And sadly, we have to deal with that as best we can. Thank you very much.
Bruce Gagnon, Daniel Lazar, thank you ever so much, gents, for joining me and giving your great thoughts. And thanks so much. Have a great day there.
Thank you.